Good news, there is some balance tuning in this reset. Bad news, the balance tuning is very small. Good news, Blizzard also announced more balance tuning is gonna come the next reset. That's the situation we are in today. Some players were a little bit off, as they were expecting, as we ourselves pointed out as well, that once the race to World First was over, we could have seen some touches to the state of the specs, but then we saw the changes, and the changes were very little, but quite quickly Blizzard came in and announced that there were going to be more changes by the next reset week. So at the very least now we know a bit more is going to be coming. But what is available for now? What are the few changes we can see for now? We have some changes to the dungeons, some changes to the bosses being mostly nerfed in Mythic Plus, and then to the specs as well. The first spec being changed is Frost Death Knight. The buffs in question related to Frost Decay are that now Chill Streak can bounce 3 additional times from their tier set instead of 2, and that the chance to proc has an increased effect, 35% to 30%. On top of this, the base damage of the ability itself is increased by 10%, obliterate damage is increased by 8%, as well as more damage to Enduring Chill and Piercing Chill. Now, these buffs overall are a very small increase to Frost Death Knight's damage. Even if you add them up, it would line up to be less than 5% of a buff. And then if you look at the state of Frost Decay right now, in the raid, when it comes to overall results, they are quite low down. Even if you look at the general rankings in tier lists of the performance, you see Frost being quite low down. You also see Frost being amongst the lowest in terms of performance in the raid. Not that it gets particularly better when you switch from the raid to Mythic Plus. Frost Decay is also quite low down when it comes to the performance in Mythic Plus, in dungeons. So we can say at the very least, as far as which specs should have needed some changes, Frost Decay would have come in the conversation. Perhaps you could have mentioned the Shadow Priest, you could have mentioned maybe Devastation Evoker, Windwalker perhaps, or definitely both of the Warlock specs, not Demonology, also could have been part of the conversation. So Frost Decay does get attention, but at the same time, this attention is quite tiny. Definitely not enough to greatly change the state of the spec right now. We have a disclaimer though towards Frost Decay, as well as any other spec able to wield a two-handed weapon. As you know, the legendary axe has been shown and looted and seen recently after the world first kill of Echo, and the weapon itself has started being tested, being simmed, and at the moment it looks like it is very, very strong, even for a legendary. We're talking about 10 or even 15% and above more damage for anyone who has it, so that could be a caveat for making the spec even stronger, but that will go for any spec that can actually wield this weapon. After Frost, you have the buffs to Restoration Druid. That is a very simple buff, very short and concise. 3% more healing to Restoration Druid. This is likely just a numbers game. Just by looking at the actual numbers of the results, Restoration Druid was factually amongst the lowest in terms of HPS in the raid. They definitely don't have that many HPS problems in Mythic Plus. They have a much easier time keeping up their power in Mythic Plus, especially due to their tier set. That is because the tier set of Resto Druid doesn't really scale in the raid. It's not that it's powerful 1 in Mythic Plus and then becomes powerful 4 in the raid because there are 4 times as many people. It remains just as powerful. So it's obviously very good in Mythic Plus with fewer players, but once you get into Mythic Raiding, for example, with 20, it's not nearly as strong. So that's one of the buffs that was also somewhat necessary when it comes to the raid for Restoration Druid. Talking about buffs, now we move back to damage, and Shadow Priest gets a 5% damage buff. Same level really as Frost Death Knight. Shadow Priest was also towards the bottom of the results, towards the bottom of the performance when it came to DPS, 125 versus 123. They are very close to each other, so they also get help in terms of their performance in the raid, and obviously of course in Mythic Plus as well. Same help is also given to Warlock, because Affliction and Distraction also get 6% more damage, both of them. Once more, of course, Affliction and Distraction have a much lower down performance compared to Demo. Even in the results, Affliction and Destro were quite low as well. So another one of the specs we mentioned that we could have seen receiving buffs. However, where things get a bit confusing is that these two were the last of the initial changes. So as I mentioned, players feeling like we didn't really get that many. This is also one of the reasons why. We saw buffs to Destro, to Affliction, to Shadow, to Frost DK, and then that's it, right? So for example, big question marks about the lack of Windwalker Monk in any changes, any adjustments when it comes to buffs. Same could be said for Devastation Evoker, and even for perhaps a few of the specs hovering towards the bottom half. And then there was of course some other players having another question. Another group of players wasn't even looking at the bottom. The other group of players was looking at the top, and they were wondering, where are the nerfs to Assassination, to Outlaw, to Havoc, to Beast Mastery? Where are they? Because in this set of tuning we have gotten none. That is the other question players are having towards the current performances we have seen so far in terms of the top performers perhaps doing a bit too well, and then of course the bottom performers also needing some help in terms of buffs. However, what also happened as we enter a new reset, our second fortified week, we also get some changes, namely some nerfs to Mythic Plus dungeons. Now, if you were to listen to the actual data and wonder which of the dungeons should be nerfed, especially if we looked at the end of the last week, the end of the Entangling Bursting Tyrannical week, looking at the difficulty level of the dungeons, we should be expecting nerfs, for example, to a dungeon like Muruzond's Rise, remaining by quite a bit the harder dungeon last week, and even at the very start, at the very beginning of this week, we have once more Muruzond's Rise. So, in terms of changes, Muruzond's Rise is indeed the dungeon that gets nerfed the most. For starters, we actually even have unannounced changes on top of the already published nerfs. Number one, the timer is now 36 minutes instead of 35, so that's a nerf to the dungeon in and of itself, as well as a very necessary nerf to the time lost battlefield, because in that boss fight there was a very clearly overtuned ad that would spawn, which is the one casting the serrated arrows, or if you were Horde, the serrated axe, that would tick for an unbelievable amount of damage if you were so unfortunate to get that ad to cast it on a non-tank player. Now, this has been nerfed by 25%, it will still hurt like a motherfucker, but now it's perhaps a bit more survivable. Now, of the officially announced changes, we also get Tyr, the first boss, having its health reduced by 15%. This is more so that the boss fight won't be an 8-minute long boss fight the deeper you go into key levels, as it gets a little bit boring and repetitive at high keys. Then you have nerfs to the last boss, Chronolord Deus. Number one, the temporal breath damage, so tank problems, that gets reduced by 20%, and the dot left behind is reduced by 15%. You also have the vulnerability effect of the Infinity Nova, so of the orbs you have to stagger, the orbs you have to delay to prevent killing everyone, is now reduced from 250% more damage taken to only 75%. Now, to avoid some confusion, this doesn't mean you can now do them both at the same time. This doesn't mean you should be doing the same folding orbs at the same time. This just means that now, if you fail once during the encounter, if you have just one misstep, you don't get completely one-shot and wipe immediately and ruin the entire fight. It only means you almost die, it only means it gets very dangerous, but you might survive in some way. Basically, it gives you a way to recover from the mistake rather than being a 100% fail. But the mechanic and the way you want to play the fight stays the exact same. So these are the nerfs given to Muruzond's Rise. After this, you have a nerf to the Everbloom. This time, no nerfs to trash mobs, no nerfs to anything other than the second boss, or we should say nerfs to the council fight. Because the Ancient Protectors get a lot of focus on Dulu, so the tank buster ad, which is creating a lot of problems in that fight. Number 1, the Noxious charge damage is reduced by 25%. The Noxious discharge pools on the ground that follow the charge are also reduced by 25%, and the impact time, so the travel time of the discharge to land on the ground, is now 2 seconds instead of 1.5 seconds. That is also a comprehensive set of nerfs to this second or first, depending on the order you're going for, boss in the Everbloom. Now this is all we have as far as nerfs, mostly given to the dungeons, and then the buffs we have mentioned given to the specs. As I said, not quite the time to go full Doomer mode for the specs that were not touched, because as we have mentioned, Blizzard has also pointed out that they will be pushing for more changes and more tuning by the next reset, by December the 5th. So there is still some hope to see some changes to a few of the other specs that did not make it in this first cut of balance tuning. Besides that, positive set of changes to some of the dungeons, some of the more problematic dungeons or the bosses in some of the dungeons. So for now, it's all good. It's now time to take a pause and wait exactly what they will come up with on December the 5th to see the remaining part of the changes to the tuning of the specs. But for today, on this Wednesday, this is all we have. So we are starting our goodbyes as usual by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, of course, as usual, be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, keeping the window open gets your neck pretty cold, so I need to stay protected.